Hi, everyone. As introduced, my name is Ross Hutchings. I lead the Microsoft on AWS business for our commercial side of the business. And this is Cindy Dixon, who does a similar role for our public sector business. We're here today to talk to you about why AWS is a great place to run Microsoft workloads, go through some of the ways that we've helped organizations reduce risk, reduce cost, and open up some of the innovation available through the AWS platform relating to their Microsoft environment. So I like numbers, and what I want to share here is what we're hearing is reasons organizations choose AWS to run their Microsoft workloads. Some of these numbers may be new to you, some you may have heard already previously. Up the top left is uptime and reliability. So AWS have a very reliable platform because we've been running cloud services for quite some time. For 11 years for the Microsoft workloads, 13 years for the overall AWS platform. AWS have, just according to public health dashboards from the major public cloud providers, we have 7 times less downtime than the next largest cloud provider. And the reason that's important when you're delivering a service to your customers, constituents, citizens, it's really important to deliver a very stable, reliable service. If the top middle number of the public cloud environment, AWS run 57.7% of the Microsoft Windows servers. It's a number that not many people realize, but it's important because to the top right in experience, we've been running Microsoft workloads for quite some time. And that gives people, I suppose, the peace of mind that they're not experimenting and running Microsoft software on AWS. We do this for a lot of other organizations. Millions of organizations, or millions of people consume Microsoft software on the AWS platform. I mentioned the 11 years of running Windows servers or Microsoft software on the public cloud in AWS. We released a service with our first service with Windows Server 2003 back in 2008, and we've just had a pace of innovation since, which I'll show you on the following slide. Now, a lot of organizations, when they think of the cloud, often think of doing things in the cloud the same way that they're doing on premises. And down the bottom left, you can see the choice based on the number of services available. We have an exponentially growing list of features that we release on our platform every year. And the reason this is important, 2 of our services are storage and infrastructure, but we have many, many other services available that you can leverage when you move Microsoft workloads to the cloud. And we'll talk about some of them in the coming slides. Down the bottom middle is the performance. So there was an independent analysis done by DBBest, who do a lot of database benchmarking and database migration services for organizations. And they found that DBBest did the analysis, and then another organization, ZK Research, compared the 2 analyses of SQL Server running on Azure and SQL Server running on AWS, and found that AWS provided 2 to 3 times better price for performance. So when you're looking at comparing a workload, say SQL Server running in the cloud, it's not best just to look at the number of cores required and the amount of RAM. The actual performance of the platform is an important consideration as well. And down the bottom right is the customer focus. Part of the AWS philosophy or the Amazon philosophy is customer obsession and focusing on delivering a great customer experience. And one of those things is delivering a great price. So as we become we increase efficiencies to reduce our cost, we pass those cost savings on to our customers. And we've had 72 consecutive price reductions since we started. On that, I'm going to pass to Cindy to talk about some real-life customer stories and some of the benefits some of our customers have been seeing on the AWS platform.
Thank you so much, Ross. We have thousands of customer stories. Today, I'm going to share 2 with you. The first one is Technology One. Technology One is Australia's largest enterprise software company. They made a decision to move to cloud because they wanted to have a faster go-to-market for their products. They wanted to focus on their core business for their customers. So they looked at what their options were. They made a decision to go to AWS. They moved from their physical data center into the AWS cloud. By doing that, what they achieved was not only could they have a faster go-to-market for their customers, they continued to delight the existing customers, but they actually attracted new ones. They expanded out into other global markets. They're continuing to move into new countries every year, expanding on that. The second customer I want to talk to you about is Xero. Xero is an online accounting platform. Their focus is allowing small businesses to go online to do all of their accounting requirements fast and efficiently. They wanted to move to cloud because they wanted to be able to scale up and scale down their business as they needed to. They wanted to have a more agile environment. So what they looked to do was get their SQL platform, and they brought it over onto EC2. By looking at bringing over their SQL onto EC2, we had to look at what some licensing considerations might be. So we worked really closely with Xero, and what we were able to do is we not only designed a really robust and reliable platform for their customers that gave them the ability to rapidly deploy new updates and features and functionalities, but we're also able to find and achieve a 30% saving in their SQL licensing. So it's a fantastic outcome for our customer.
Thanks, Cindy. And on the helping customers save money and get benefit from our platform, this pace of innovation, you may have seen this slide in other people's presentations at AWS talking about the exponential growth of the features released on our platform. Not many people realize that over 90% of the features we release come from customers' requests, so people telling us this is something we would value on your platform and it would help us deliver better business outcomes. So the first service we released was Windows Server 2003 back in 2008, and we've had that exponential pace of feature release growth. So some that I'll talk about in the coming slides is FSX for Windows, or Managed Windows File Server, AWS License Manager. We partner very closely with Microsoft, and we will release services often at the same time that they release their products to market. So an example of that was .NET Core 2.0 support. As that was released, we released .NET Core 2.0 support for Lambda. But yeah, the point on the previous slide that I talked about with the 165 plus services that we've released on the platform, as you move Microsoft workloads to AWS, you unlock the ability to use a lot of the other services that we have available to drive more innovation for your software. So some of the services that we've released, FSX for Windows File Server was a service we released at reInvent last year, which is last November, and it's a managed Windows File Server. So one of the challenges people have come to us with, and this was a product based on customer demand, one of the challenges is we don't want to patch and back up and maintain a file server. There's not a lot of value to our organization in doing that. We just want to consume the service. So we've created a managed service for that. So you just turn this on and you use the file server service, and it's a native Windows file server. Another feature that we released was AWS License Manager. So AWS License Manager allows you to see software compliance on one page and manage it without using lots of different tools. You can just manage it in the one spot for both on-premises and other cloud environments, including AWS, but it also lets you enforce compliance. So, and it works for many, many software vendors. So we've got a few listed here, SAP, Microsoft, and Oracle, but most software vendors that have licensing rules, you'll be able to manage those through AWS License Manager. Just a bit of a screenshot on the console and how it works. You can define rules for how you manage the licensing, whether it's managed by physical core or virtual core or server. You can enforce licensing limits. So with this, you can say, I don't want to go over the licenses that have been assigned to us. So it stops you going into a non-compliant state. So it's a really great way to reduce the scariness of some people, well, the scariness some people feel in moving to the cloud when they think people might use more licenses than we're actually entitled to, and the fear that it could spiral out of control. So here's a visualization of what it looks like, another visualization. So down the bottom left, we have the SQL Server, where we have enforced a hard limit on the licensing. So there are 200 licenses that have been imported into this tool, and after those licenses have been exhausted, people aren't able to create another instance with SQL Server. It'll pop up with an error and it'll tell them they need to speak to their administrator. So that's a way to enforce compliance. Then there's the option of the soft limit, which is with the Oracle database in this example where there was 40 licenses imported, 50 have been used. It just lets you know that you need to place a license true up. So you can choose how you want to do that. But the point is this is available today. It's a really great way to manage and enforce compliance if required. And I mentioned that you can run this for both your on-premises environment and other clouds. It's got a really great inventory tool, so you can search on the specific product that you want, like Windows Server Data Center 2016, or whatever product that you want, and you can see where that software is being deployed and create a report off the back of that to be able to produce to the software vendor that may need that for a compliance requirement. Another feature we released just nearly 2 years ago, but not a lot of people realize, is the CPU optimization feature. So one of the things in moving to the cloud is we have a core to RAM ratio. So if you want to have a lot of RAM, one of the consequences is you may need a lot of cores. So we might have 4 cores to 16 gig RAM, or there are various ratios. But if you need lots of RAM, but you don't need all of the cores, from a licensing perspective, you're paying for cores that you may not require. So with this feature, you can disable hyperthreading and turn off cores, so you only pay for the licenses that are required, say with SQL Server, for example. So you might need a lot of RAM. Instead of 64 cores that are provisioned, you can consume 8 or 16. So it's a great way to save money, and it's available today. Now, if you look to your left and you look to your right, someone is still running Windows Server 2008 and SQL Server 2008. Actually, most organizations we talk to have some footprint of those versions of products. And it's a bit of a challenge for organizations with the end of support time frame looming. So SQL Server 2008 has already gone end of support back in July, and Windows Server 2008 is going end of support in January next year. So people might ask, how can AWS help us here? There are a couple of paths forward that we'd recommend for organizations. One of those with SQL Server is compatibility mode. This is natively available with SQL Server, and not all organizations have actually explored this path. So that's where you install a modern supported version of SQL Server and you use compatibility mode backwards to 2008. So SQL Server 2017 is actually backwards compatible to 2008. So that is one path forward. If that doesn't work because the database doesn't give you the features that you need in the modern version of SQL Server, there is another technology called, or an ISV that we work with closely called CloudHouse. They provide a product called CloudHouse Compatibility Containers, and effectively it separates the app or database from the operating system. So it allows you to run an app that may be designed for Windows Server 2003 or 2008 and make that portable to 2016 or 2019. It uses a proprietary redirection engine to translate the API calls from the old version of Windows Server to the new version of Windows Server. So it's a great way to address the end of support issue because you can pick up an old app or an app that's designed for an old version of Windows Server and run it on a modern supported version. National Australia Bank spoke at our Sydney Summit recently about the journey that they've gone on there. They packaged I think it was Oracle Primavera, a timesheeting app, because the dependencies that version had with the operating system couldn't be upgraded. So this was a really great path forward for them. And I'd encourage you to have a look at this technology if you feel it could help solve the end of support issue for you. Now, something we encourage organizations to explore in a cloud migration is optimization and right-sizing. So if you look at the orange line here, that's traditional infrastructure costs that you may have in your current environment for those who aren't really embracing the power of the cloud and being able to scale up, scale down. So say in a traditional on-premises environment, you pay for the infrastructure that you may need, and often you're not using that capacity. If you do touch the orange line, so the blue line is the utilization, if you do touch the orange line, you're often facing performance issues because you've run out of capacity. But when you're not touching the orange line, you're paying for capacity that's not required. So something that we encourage is optimization and right-sizing. AWS acquired an organization called TSO Logic back in December last year, and they provide a tool that helps analyze what your current on-premises environment is using in terms of resources, so CPU and memory utilization, and it will make a recommendation of right-sizing with software licensing included in the recommendation to suggest what the future state should be. And often there are environments or instances or VMs that may be running at 10 or 15% capacity. So if you just lift and shift that to the cloud, you're paying for a lot of resources that you don't actually need. And a consequence there as well is you're buying licenses that you may not require. So this visual, it's a bit of an eye chart, but in the top middle, the estimated cost of the on-premises environment for this environment was $5 million. If it was just a lift and shift to the cloud with the exact same capacity, the cost goes up to $6.5 million, so another $1.5 million. That's because the licensing rules change with a lot of vendors that require you to pay for virtual cores rather than physical cores, and that environment, the costs go up. But if you optimize and right-size to actually shift the environment to what you need rather than what you had provisioned on-prem, in this scenario, the cost went down to less than $3 million. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't considered optimization and right-sizing in a migration, to have a look at this approach. The TSO Logic is one tool. There are a number of others, but it's something we'd encourage at the start of a migration plan. And on that, if you're looking at the logical path of a migration, there's the discovery piece at the start. So we have tools like TSO Logic that I mentioned, but there's Movair, CloudChonk, Cloudemize, a lot of tools that are available to analyze your current environment and make the recommendations of what you should be sizing to. And then you have the planning phase. So you may have seen some of these tools or processes before, but I think planning at the start of a migration is one of the most important pieces, because for those who haven't heard of the 6 Rs, retire, rehost, replatform, retain, some apps may not make sense to move to the cloud because your plan is to retire them, or maybe move to a SaaS version of that product, or maybe just lift and shift exactly as it is. There's a tool, for example, that we acquired called Cloud Endure, and that does a block-level replication of what you've currently got in your current environment, whether it's on premises, and helps move that to an AWS instance. So there are a few parts forward, but the planning is really essential. And then after you've done the plan, using the tools that are available to you to do the migration. So we've got a few of them listed here. There's the Azure to AWS migration tool that's getting a lot of, that's having quite steady growth in usage. Cloud Endure, the AWS server migration service. We have the database migration service as well, the schema conversion tool. There are a lot of tools available in the AWS platform that we'd encourage you to explore if you haven't seen those already. And we'll have our details at the end if you have questions that you can reach out to us to send those through, and these slides will be available as well. Now, another thing not a lot of people realize is AWS have a Premier Support Agreement with Microsoft. And what that means is if you're running a Microsoft solution on the AWS cloud, you don't have to worry about who do you ring to get support for that environment. So if you have business support or enterprise support with AWS, you can phone the AWS support engineer. If it's a configuration challenge, our team can help you do that through our platform. If it's a product issue, say a bug or something with the product, we can raise that with Microsoft through our Premier Support Agreement. But what that means for you is you don't have to think, who am I going to talk to for the issue, for the challenge that I've got? We can manage that for you. And I share this because I think when I Googled it, there was one link somewhere that said that there was this agreement in place. It's something that's really valuable that not everyone knows about. Something to consider with the migration to the cloud is licensing, and I talked about the optimization and right-sizing assessments and choosing the right types of instances as well. There is unique AWS architecture that can help you reduce the cost of licensing. So in this scenario, there are a couple I'll talk through now. In this scenario, the way that AWS have regions and availability zones, you can leverage those to reduce the cost of SQL Server licensing. So the scenario on the right is a typical on-premises environment where data centers often are a fairly large geographic distance away. So one of the consequences of that is, one of the pros is you have a good disaster recovery path forward because there's a geographic distance between them. But one of the downsides is the latency. So the further apart they are, the higher the latency. So the scenario on the left is to get high availability and low latency, typically organizations will pay for 2 SQL Server databases, and then for disaster recovery and that runs in one data center. And then on the DR server, they'll run that in another data center that's geographically far away, so then you cater for the disaster. In that scenario, you're paying for 2 licenses in the data center that you have those for the high availability, and then you have a free passive failover, which is a software assurance benefit with SQL Server for the disaster recovery option. Now on the right, if you're leveraging the AWS availability zones, we have them geographically close enough together for very low latency, so single-digit millisecond latency, but far enough away to cater for disaster, or to give you a solid disaster recovery path forward. So in this scenario, you would pay for 1 SQL Server database in one availability zone and have the free passive failover with the software assurance benefit for the secondary. So it's a way, in that scenario, to reduce the cost of your SQL Server licensing by 50%. Again, not often when people are architecting solutions for the cloud, they're not considering licensing as an implication, so I just wanted to highlight that as something to consider. Another thing is SQL Server and containers. I'd ask you to put up your hands for those who have heard of this before, but I can't see you. The SQL Server and containers was released, or Microsoft made that available with SQL Server 2017, and it effectively lets you Well, one of the big benefits is reducing wasted capacity when you want to run SQL Server, either on-premises or in the cloud. So if you look at the scenario on the left, with a traditional SQL Server, or when you're spinning up SQL Server databases in VMs, you provision capacity for what you may need with that instance or with that VM, and often there's wasted capacity. So you might say, I need 4 cores for one instance. If you look in the green side there, one VM has 60%, is using 60% capacity. The next one's 30%, 70%. So there's all of these instant or VMs that aren't using the full capacity, so there's wasted resources there. And then there's one there that has 100% utilization, so that may encounter performance issues. So with one of the benefits of containers, specifically SQL Server and containers, is you can use a container orchestration engine like EKS or ECS to pull resources. So it means if there's excess capacity with one container and another needs more capacity, you can share those resources. So the consequence is you can either put more SQL Server onto the same box or have smaller servers or smaller instances, and that means there's fewer licenses required. So that's available with SQL Server 2017, and I mentioned the compatibility mode before with SQL Server. You can use compatibility mode to go backwards from 2017 to 2008. So a lot of organizations can leverage the benefit of containers and still run some of the older infrastructure or older databases. Another path forward for SQL Server is exploring Linux. So SQL Server on Linux has been made available with the latest release, and it's a way to reduce the cost because you're not paying for the operating system, or if you are for a commercial version of Linux, it's a lower cost. It's something that we're seeing more and more organizations explore. Linux, the options for Linux available on AWS will give you high performance and reliability, and SQL Server runs very well on them. So for those who weren't aware that it was available, I'd encourage you to explore it. And there is actually a tool that's available to help migrate SQL Server from Windows Server to Linux. So we have an AWS tool that's, that you don't have to pay for that will help do that migration for you. That is all of the content. Our details, I don't think we've put there, but if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at Microsoft and Amazon.com. It's an easy one to remember. I suppose typically people ask us licensing questions around scenarios that they're looking on embarking or configuration scenarios, so please feel free to reach out to us and we'll be happy to help you. I think that is this.
Thank you.
We've given you a few minutes back.